From the Internet Law and Policy Foundry, this is the Tech Policy Grind podcast. Every 2 weeks, we'll discuss recent developments and exciting topics in the technology and Internet law and policy space. I'm Rima Musa, and I'm a member of the 4th cohort of Foundry Fellows. The Foundry is a collaborative organization for Internet law and policy professionals who are passionate about disruptive innovation. In this episode, Foundry Fellow Joe Catapano sits down with Jim Lewis of the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C., to discuss the geopolitics of Internet governance at the United Nations and International Telecommunication Union, as well as a look ahead to U.S. cyber policy in the next 2 years and the election for ITU Secretary General. Jim worked as a diplomat and a member of the Senior Executive Service, and developed groundbreaking policies on encryption and cybersecurity. He has authored numerous publications on technology and digital issues, and testified numerous times before Congress. Joe is a member of the 4th class of ILPF Fellows. He currently works on the Global Stakeholder Engagement Team at the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, or ICANN. Joe played a large role in the multi-stakeholder effort to transition the stewardship of the Internet Assigned Numbers Authority, sometimes referred to as the IANA transition, and has spent the last 10 years working on tech policy issues being discussed at the United Nations.
Good afternoon, Jim. How are you?
Good. How are you, Joe?
Excellent. Thank you. Jim and I have known each other for quite a while now, and this isn't the first time we've discussed these issues. However, I think we're in a unique environment in 2022, and I thought now would be a good opportunity to dig deep into everything that is going on. And so, Jim, let's dive right in here. Can you kind of set the geopolitical scene for us in 2022 with regards to Internet governance writ large? We know there are many deliberations and discussions happening at global bodies such as the United Nations and International Telecommunications Union. So if you could, for the listeners, what are the key groups people should be paying attention to, and who are the key players?
Yeah, it's a good year to be talking about this because we're seeing stresses at a level we haven't seen before on internet governance and the international system in general. You've basically got two very powerful countries that have a different view of the world and a different view of how the internet should be governed. What the rules are. And of course, they're interested in seeing a greater role given to sovereign control, less to the multi-stakeholder community. So I think that's the primary driver here is we are in a contest. It's not a military contest, and that puts the US at a little bit of a disadvantage. But you've got people with a very different view of how the world should work. The internet has become so crucial to that it's become an area where you have tremendous discussions, debates. What are some key places? I follow the UN pretty closely, both the first committee, the second committee, ECOSOC, the ITU. The Secretary General is doing a lot. He's created a whole process, a digital strategy. At some point, they'll get a tech envoy. So the UN is one of the key players here, and that one will see things with the IGF in partnership with them. Those are probably the places where most of this discussion will occur. You've got something called the Program of Action that are Western democracies. You've got a Russian proposal for a new cybercrime law. You have, of course, what they call the Eternal OEWG. Eternal because it lasts 5 years. Right, so you've got some good venues here for discussion. IGF Plus, I think, will be one of the big departures, so that's a key one to watch.
Yeah, and so for those that might be unfamiliar, IGF stands for the Internet Governance Forum, and OEWG is the open-ended working group at the United Nations. Go ahead.
So this is Washington, so it has to be an acronym-rich environment.
Exactly. So we're only a quarter of the way through the year. Much has happened already. What progress or lack thereof has transpired since the beginning of 2022?
I think there's two things that we need to pay attention to. The first is it's been difficult for the UN and its high-level process, the Secretary General's digital strategy. It's been difficult for them to build up momentum. And some of that is because governments aren't sure what they want the UN to actually do. You have some internal difficulties in how the UN organizes itself. So if there was a venue that was thinking about what should digital governance look like in the future, that's probably the key one from an intergovernmental point of view. But it's been slower than we expected. The other thing, of course, is the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which has just completely uh, undone international politics. The Russians had a whole internet strategy that they were rolling out with the BRICS. The BRICS are Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, countries that the Russians think will be good partners for them. They might still be good partners, but I think you're seeing a lot of people aren't so eager to jump into bed with the Russians as they were, say, 2 months ago. So I think that means folks are taking a step back and saying, how does the calculations I made, say, a year ago, how have they changed because of what Russia has done? So those are the two things. Secretary General's plans, still a lot of possibility. It's got a longer timeline than you might think, but I think you have a very positive development there. The Russians have complicated things. The Chinese are monkeying with this. They're experimenting. They were going to come up with an alternate internet. They were going to come up with an alternate governance structure, and they know they want to do something. They're kind of unsure what direction to take. So another thing to watch is the ITU election and who gets that. I'll make a final point on this one. Don't assume it's us versus them. There's a huge group of countries in the middle to whom some of what the authoritarian countries say is attractive, right? People are a little unsure. There's a heritage of colonialism that really hampers the Europeans, a lot of anger there. You've got some distrust of the US, stoked in part by China and Russia. So this is not just us versus them. It's not a bilateral contest. It's a political contest with many actors, some of whom remain undecided.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. An interesting point. I feel like, when you and I talk, probably, I don't know, 6, 7 years ago, there was this, kind of middle ground, these middle countries that were kind of moving maybe in the direction of, a more, kind of multi-stakeholder, less, kind of one nation, one vote type of proposals. So now I think what I'm hearing you say is they may have moved back more toward, where the Russians may be. But the war has obviously, kind of changed the dynamic. So are these kind of, and again, I call them, kind of middle countries, but if there's a better term for that, please, please kind of, correct me. Uh, are they really just sitting back and waiting, or are they kind of more inclined in one direction or another?
Well, in that category, I'd put Turkey, Indonesia, Brazil, India. These aren't necessarily middle countries. They're big countries, right? They haven't quite figured out what their policy is. The Indians might be further along. The Brazilians are further along. There are others, South Africa. So we have a whole set of global players that didn't exist when we started the whole internet governance project. And their views have to be taken into account. A little difficult because they haven't quite figured out what their views are in all cases, right? One thing that also shapes this is the reaction to big tech. We came up with a governance structure at the end of the 20th century that's been remarkably successful. right? When you think of the things that have driven the growth of the internet as a central infrastructure for human life, those policies, those governance structures were right. But at the same time, there's a few big companies that clearly dominate the market and have perhaps not always been as what's a good word here? Not always been as forthright as they might have been. So there is some global hostility in regard to big tech, and I think that shapes people's views here. So you have you have a whole debate over what's the role of human rights, what's the role of the rule of law, um, what is the role of the multi-stakeholder community, right? And for the rest of the world, how does this all fit into development? So another thing to watch is the SDG. I can't remember what it's Strategic Development Goals, Sustainable Development Goals.
Sustainable development.
Sustainable Development Goals. SDG 17 in particular, I think, is the one that affects us. But when the rest of the world thinks about this, um, top of the mind for them is development. And that's not always been top of the mind for either the Western countries or the big tech players.
Excellent, excellent. And now, kind of on the other side, and I'm curious in terms of, I feel, you know, since the Biden administration has come into power, there's been kind of more of a focus on U.S. Europe cooperation. Certainly, that has been put into overdrive given the war. Um, can you talk a little bit about the relationship on both sides of the Atlantic and how they are approaching these issues?
There are tensions within Europe that mean there are tensions in the transatlantic relationship. And the key one comes up over and over again. You hear them talking about digital sovereignty, tech sovereignty. You hear people talking about European values. And I usually ask them, well, how are European values different from universal values or transatlantic values? And I say, oh, they aren't. But the fact that they're thinking in those terms, Europe has a real dilemma, which is it hasn't kept up. I mean, people used to talk about China displacing the US. That isn't happening, but China is displacing Europe, right? And President Macron, he's still president, actually said, well, we're moving to a world where it will be centered around the US and China, and Europe will be on the periphery. That's a bit gloomy. I don't think that's right. It's not in our interest. We need a strong Europe to defend democracy and rule of law. And so the Biden administration has correctly, I think, decided to pursue cooperation with key allies, Europe, Australia, Japan. They're trying to get India in that club. That's sort of the diplomatic initiative here. And the Europeans have some choices to make. They decided some time ago that they would become a regulatory superpower because they weren't going to be a military superpower. They weren't going to be a economic superpower. I think that was a little bit of a mistake, but it creates a tension because the Europeans create rules and then expect the rest of the world uh, to um, to observe them. If I can be a little inflammatory,
Go right ahead.
that would be you could call that regulatory colonialism, right? And I think that so far hasn't been a problem, but building stronger relations with Europeans, building a stronger Europe, helping to build that is clearly in the U.S. interest. But there's some internal tensions that we need to work out. The good news is the Europeans are pretty much where we are when it comes to multi-stakeholder governance, when it comes to the values and norms that guide internet governance. So there's a basis for partnership based on those shared values that I think will ultimately lead us to the right place.
Great, great. Sticking with the U.S., I'd like to get your thoughts. Earlier in the year, we had I believe it was called the Summit for Democracy,
Mhm.
and within that, there was some tech policy topics talked about. There was this, I believe it's called the Alliance for the Future of the Internet, um, or something along those lines. I was wondering if you could just comment on that. How do you see that playing into, you know, U.S. strategy or the geopolitical dynamic itself. Where do you see that going? And just any general thoughts you had on that kind of initiative.
It's funny because someone I know in the Chinese government actually called me up and said, "Hey, is this alliance for the future of the internet? Is it serious? Should we take it seriously?" And I said no, right? Uh, no for this particular initiative, but yes for the general direction of policy, right? So a lot of times, democratic administrations tend to get a lot of academics. The academics aren't quite used to the realities of governing, and so having a seminar and writing a term paper is not the same as getting agreement. That's a problem for this administration because it will take 2 or 3 years to get any new agreement on internet governance, which means they're coming right up on the window of when they can launch something. I think, though, that the Alliance for the Future of the Internet is a good indicator of both the direction the US would like to go, the values that will shape the direction the US would like to go, and the recognition that's really happened since this administration, thankfully, came into office. Really, a recognition that this has become a crucial shaping point. What I've said to people at State and the White House is um, internet governance, tech governance, digital governance will be the issue of the international issue of the next few years, and so we need to have policies. Uh, IFA, Internet Future Alliance, that could be one of them. Um, Figuring out a way, though, to work it into a message that's more appealing. And this has been a problem, I think, for the multi-stakeholder model for a long time, right? Um, the things you say to the developing countries, to the new powers, they have to have a bigger economic role. They have to be more respectful of their cultural traditions. They have to focus on development. So we have some work to do to come up with a message, but the Biden administration has been good at saying the direction that we will be going as a country, and the direction that's best for the world to go as an international society.
Excellent, excellent. In addition to the alliance and the other things we had just talked about, there's also a new cyber bureau at the State Department. Now, obviously, in the previous administration, the State Department looked a lot different. Um, so now, how do you see this new bureau? I guess re-engaging might be the best term on a host of tech policy issues, not only with U.S. engagement, at the international bodies. How do you see this bureau, you know, kind of working? What do you expect from them, and maybe even what would you like to see from them?
So it's more than a cyber bureau, and I think that's a really positive sign. You've got the old cyber shop that Chris Painter used to run. To that, they've tagged the parts of the Economic Bureau that did spectrum management, internet governance, the things that Rob Strayer used to run. And they've added in people from the human rights part of the State Department to look at freedom of speech rights. So it's a very broad portfolio, and it's ambitious. And I think that it's a good sign that State has done this. It's taken a bit longer than anyone would have hoped. Uh, why that is, I don't know. I mean, some of it's probably working with the Hill, but it's State's moving in the right direction. Now they have a big task in front of them, which is that, and just as an aside, I don't know what you get, but when I talk to Europeans, eventually I get the question: Is Trump coming back? Right. So we're still recovering in some ways, right? And this bureau can help with that recovery, but they've got to sketch out a positive agenda that goes beyond cybersecurity, that looks at digital governance, and that takes into account the interests of more than Europe and Japan.
Excellent, excellent. Um, and then kind of moving, sticking somewhat with the U.S., but also moving more toward these international institutions that we both know about. The election for the ITU Secretary General in the fall. So somewhat ironically, right, that we have a candidate from the United States. We also have a candidate from Russia. First question is what effects will that election have on what happens at the ITU? Because I think a lot of people don't really understand what the Secretary General of the ITU does. So maybe you could shed a little bit of light on that, and then we can move more toward the the dynamic now with the war. Uh, how does that affect kind of the election itself?
The U.S. ignored the ITU for years. It's not just the last administration, but probably the two administrations before it. So it's had a graduate of Moscow State University as the director general, and then a Chinese individual. Um, Great people. I met them both, but definitely coming from a different place. So this administration has done a good job figuring out that we need to take the ITU more seriously. Right? We need to have a bigger presence, and all of us remember some of the struggles in previous meetings over governance and over the work and the whole thing. So we'll see who wins. It would be a shock if the Russian won. That would be a really bad sign. But it's not a done deal for the American. So it would be good to get her experienced, knowledgeable ITU official and diplomat. So that would be great. But beyond that, we need to think of the general question: what is the role of the ITU? Under the previous incumbents and encouraged by Russia and China, their position was this multi-stakeholder thing. It's amateur. It's haphazard. It's out of date. We need to replace it with a state-centric view of internet governance, and the ITU should be the place that governs the internet, the same way it governs dial telephones, right? And honestly, that message has a little bit of a draw in the rest of the world. So I think that's the main point for us: is where does the ITU fit into internet governance? What's the alternate model? And I would say it would be the IGF is the alternate model, or IGF plus. And how do we make sure that other countries agree with us? So this will be one of the debate points for the next year or so, even after the election.
Great. And going back, can you kind of give us an idea of what the ITU Secretary General role actually is? Like what is the function? Why is it important? Because I don't think people have a grasp of the role.
So the ITU has been around. I think it started out as the International Telegraphy Union.
Yeah.
Been around a long time. And it predates the UN, but it became a UN body. And it sets the rules for global communications, right? It's focused on moving beyond telegraphs to phones, to satellites, to spectrum. And those are crucial roles: the ability of the world to manage spectrum allocations in the ways that don't conflict, to come up with common rules that allow telephone connections to interconnect, to allocate assignments in space for communications radios, telecommunication satellites. Those are critical roles. And people say, well, so they set the rules, they create the architecture for telecommunications. Doesn't that include the internet? And the answer, as I expect most of your audience knows, is no. This is a very different architecture. It's decentralized. It's global. It relies on different protocols and different technologies. Not so much anymore, but certainly different protocols. But there's this strong tendency to say the ITU's role should expand to include internet governance. Russia, China, others like that, because then it would be the governments making the decision, not the multi-stakeholder community. Right? So that's, I think, the primary tension. We haven't done as much to persuade the world that you don't need the ITU to be running the internet. Some of that is, you have to admit, from the outside, the multi-stakeholder model looks a little messy. What I usually say to people is, yeah, it's a mess, but it's worked really well. And why would you move? Why break it if it's not, doesn't need fixed? But that's not entirely persuasive. So I think that's, the ITU is the rule setter for spectrum, for telecom, for communications in space. And there's this question that comes up repeatedly: shouldn't they also be the rule setter for the internet? So that's where we're going to have to make a stronger case.
Excellent, excellent. So in the fall, in addition to the election, we have the plenipotentiary meeting, which is every 4 years. And so uh, what's at stake in that meeting? What's on the table there?
Affectionately known as the Plenipot. So not an acronym, but another inside.
Right.
I think the dynamics have changed a little bit. Prior to Ukraine, I think the Russians would have made a much stronger push for increasing the ITU's role in governance. Now I think that's a little more on the table. Everyone is saying, so. There's general agreement that we need to figure out how digital governance works, that we depend on this thing. People aren't comfortable with the unregulated, sort of anarchic approach that has worked really well for growth, but there's a discomfort for that. So I think the issue on the table is, um, what do we do moving ahead on tech governance, on internet governance? How far they'll get, this comes up every time. Uh, Usually it involves last minute saves by the US and its friends. But I think that's for me, that's the issue that I'm most interested in.
Great. And so we've talked a lot about governments, and rightfully so. How are other organizations getting involved to the extent they can? Civil society, private sector, academics, technologists. Um, can you give us a sense of how other actors are working within this framework?
Sure. And this is why I keep coming back to the Internet Governance Forum, the IGF, because I think they're the main focal point for the if you've been to the IGF meeting, it's sort of a gathering of the tribes, and you've
Right.
got civil society and governments and uh, companies. So that's really the alternative. Figuring out what their role when they grow up should be, and the Secretary General is putting, I think, a lot of emphasis on the IGF plus. Um, some people in the UN aren't entirely comfortable with the smaller role that governments have been given. Maybe they aren't there anymore, but um, I think figuring out what the IGF does moving forward. It can't be the IGF of the past. Civil society has a problem, and the problem is that the Chinese and the Russians would like it to go away, right? And they have shut it out of the OEWG, and there's this awkward mechanism where there's side meetings where they're allowed to speak. They don't get to address the whole group. Figuring out where civil society fits in, I think, is one of the tasks for us, and how to make better use of them. For democracies, there is no alternative to the involvement of the multi stakeholder community and civil society. And so it's something we're going to have to defend. Private sector, they're more interested in a stable environment, and they have supported the multi stakeholder model, the civil society model. Um, I think that's a positive. When you think of the big companies, they're on board with this. I haven't said the word ICANN yet, the Internet Corporation for Signing Names and Numbers. ICANN's, the profile of ICANN as an issue has gone way down since the link to the US government was severed. And that means when you talk to people from other countries, they think it's not the issue it was, even though every once in a while some of our opponents try and bring it back up. All the Russians said it was hilarious that um, that everything was located in the United States. And it's like, that's not true. But uh, that's, for me, that's the issue moving forward, is how do we come up with a new multi-stakeholder model, maybe a little more role for government, a crucial role for civil society, and how do we connect it to actual policy? Could be a role for the UN, most likely something in the Secretary General's portfolio, maybe an ECOSOC. ECOSOC is the second committee, stands for Economic and Social Affairs. Uh, we are moving towards some revamping of internet governance.
Where are So we mentioned the private sector, civil society, et cetera. Where are technologists in all this? Where engineers, network operators, they have the base of knowledge and keep things functioning. Where do they fit into this picture?
Well, you that was a red herring. You know my answer to that, and these are political issues, right? They're diplomatic issues. Sure, you need to know the technology, but technologists have no greater legitimacy than any of the other actors involved, right? And so it's hard because when this thing started out, IETF, the Internet Engineering Task Force, they pretty much made the decisions, right? And that's worked out really well, but it's not a good way to deal with some of these political issues that we're facing. So important role for the technologists, but not a central role, and certainly not the only role. Um, that's been one of the changes. State's new bureau is a sign of that. Countries around the world now are beginning to come up with digital strategies with tech envoys. With It's part of governance now. Um, much more than technology. So important to have that technological base of understanding, but this is a political issue.
Sure, absolutely. Um, all right. So if you had to look into your crystal ball for, post plenipotentiary, 2023, um, and beyond, where do you think we're at, a year from now?
Well, the safest answer is to say that someone was telling me the other day that the motto for internet governance should be stumbling forward, right? And it's not a bad one, but I think the other thing is, as you know, having seen many plenty-pots, a lot of times the solution is kick the can, right? So these are tough issues. Let's just move it down the road a little bit. So my bet is we won't have resolved any of these things, but that we'll have hopefully beaten off the efforts for a new internet governance system, that will have won the election in the ITU, and that will have the start in the IGF and the IGF Plus of a revamped model of internet governance. That's more than the plenty pot, but I think those are the things that are going on that we should watch.
Great, great. And uh, in terms of just we as the class of fellows for the Foundry come from all different professional backgrounds, and of course there are you know thousands among thousands of tech policy professionals out there that are following the same issues. What is the best way for people to stay engaged on these issues?
So that's a tough one. I was thinking about that because it's a new portfolio. The media covers it sort of haphazardly. You've got to look at the Quartzes and the Wireds and the Voxes and others. I just don't mean those are the ones that come to mind.
Sure.
The new media will cover this more. You have to pay attention to the UN, which puts out a lot of material that you'll have to wade through, including the ITU. I think you have to look at some of the civil society organizations that track this. A lot of times they have a particular agenda, but that's what I'd say is new media, UN, civil society. Track them and develop your own list of things to watch and people to follow. Um, that would be the best way to do this.
Great, great, excellent. Well, um, Thank you for your time, Jim. I really appreciate it. This has been a fascinating conversation. There's so much to look forward to this year and so much to follow. So I really appreciate your expertise and insights. And we will be speaking to you later in the year, I'm sure, to get an update on all this stuff.
Thanks, Joe. It's going to be a busy couple of years, so we'll have plenty to talk about.
All right. Thanks, Jim.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Tech Policy Grind podcast. Be sure to check out the Internet Law and Policy Foundry on LinkedIn and Twitter. And if you enjoyed this episode, give us a 5-star rating. It really helps out the show. The Tech Policy Grind podcast comes out every other Thursday. See you next time.